we can leave Estelle and Grand-Valène, Clément Dussat. They're going to talk to us about writing fixed in pilgrimage sites in the Holy Land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlo, and thank you for your invitation. Thank you to all the team. So, in 1881, Charles Clermont-Ganneau discovered 4 painted sheets of paper glued to the interior wall of the cenacle in Jerusalem. They displayed names, dates, and coats of arms of the 15th century. And this French diplomat, one of the pioneers of French archaeology in Palestine, had just found a rare evidence of a common practice of the late Middle Ages, fossilized in the early place, messages and drawings on paper, in addition to the graffiti, which are better known. Pilgrimage to the Holy Land in 14th and 15th century and their specific features have been the subject of recent studies, demonstrating the importance of the socialization of the elites, the nobility, and the upper urban classes. Traveling was one of the means to win honor and glory, and spatial mobility promoted social mobility. Pilgrimage to Jerusalem was a vital part of noble and would-be noble self-representation at the end of the 15th century. And these elites were particularly attentive to their visual communication during their travels, leaving their coat of arms and names. Nevertheless, a careful examination of these graphic practices is still to be done. After the important work of Detlef Crack, who focused on noble travel and the emblematic signs left especially in the monastery St. Catherine in the Sinai, the Latin graffiti in the Holy Land are studied by Clément in his PhD thesis. And both of these works show that graffiti are prominent parts within a galaxy of ways of writing. But other ways of leaving one's marks during the pilgrimage exist on the margin of the graffiti. So our aim today is to focus on the transformation of the visual, graphic, and material communication of pilgrims in the Holy Land at the end of the Middle Ages, thanks to monumental testimonies and pilgrimage accounts. By studying the vast range of personal writings in the holy places, then by focusing on the papers discovered in the cenacle in relation to the use of writings displayed in the church, and finally by questioning these ephemeral writings on mobile and perishable medium and their relationship to time and space, which are also key elements for the definition of graffiti.
Many traces of graffiti, incised or painted, are still visible in the holy places. Dipinti are slightly more numerous, as this one. In the 14th and 16th century, they represent 51.2% of the total amount, even though their nature makes them more vulnerable to erosion. To build our corpus, we decided to take into account all the graphic and emblematic signs that were not considered as inscriptions and were therefore at the margins of traditional epigraphic and even historic studies. It includes a considerable range of signs, very different from one to the other by their datation. For example, from the 10th century till modern period, shape, size, and technique. This wide range already exceeded forecasts and seemed to be quite representative of the variety of signs pilgrims and travelers could live in holy places. However, a close reading of the pilgrimage accounts provides clues to other ways of living signs in holy places that the absence of material remains would have made impossible to guess. Felix Fabry, a German Dominican who made 2 pilgrimages in Holy Land in 1480 and 1483, recounts his experience in the Evagatorium. In the Holy Sepulchre, he criticizes practices that he considers deviant, arma depigendo, and scribendo nomina sua, that is, what we call graffiti. At the same time, he condemns, while assimilating it, a practice of cartas depictas parietibus affigendo, which means displaying painted sheets of paper as those found by Clermont-Ganneau in the Cenacle. An early clue of such a custom can be found in the written account book of Henry, Earl of Derby, for his journeys to Prussia and Holy Land between 1390 and 1393. These documents, you have to extract here, records he had his coat of arms and those of his companions, that is 8 coat of arms, painted on wooden panels, that is tabulae in the Latin text, or papers, papyri, on several occasions and in different places. Leaving 1 coat of arms was not uncommon at that time. At the end of medieval period, nobles used to have their presence announced by displaying their coat of arms in the places where they were going to reside. It was a way to announce their coming and then their presence once they had arrived. Leaving them in prestigious places, moreover, made it possible to attest their passage and to indicate it to those who followed. But it was also a way of remembering a generous donor. We know, for instance, that back in the 1330s, noblemen were accustomed to place their banners in or on the churches of Mount Tabor in Palestine, the site of transfiguration of Christ, and then to spend the night there. Painting them on wood panels or sheets of paper was probably a trick to make it easier and increase the number of emblem deposits by making them as they went along. This pragmatic consideration may also explain why French crests of arms were painted around 1350 in the nave of the Basilica of the Nativity in Bethlehem, as it was either impossible or very expensive to bring one's crest in this way and to hang a real crest on a marble column. We know, for instance, other examples, that the coat of arms of Richard, Earl of Beauchamp, was set in the Holy Sepulchre after he made an offering in 1408, and that a French knight, Nompart de Caumont, left his banner beside the precedent one a few years later in 1419. It is hard to say in which proportion writing was important in these mobile panels, for we have nothing left, almost nothing left. But the comparison with painted crests of arms kept in the holy places show that most of them had an inscription. We can also have an idea looking at, for instance, the panels painted with the coat of arms of the members of the Order of the Golden Fleece, here in Bruges, or drawings from the 15th centuries, as the examples by in the Book of Tournaments by René d'Anjou. From the 1460s, a few textual evidences highlight this practice. In 1462, Sebald Ritter left his coat of arms painted on a parchment in Compostela. Jean and Anselme Adorno, important pilgrims from Bruges, wrote a prayer accompanied by their painted coat of arms, which they left on the tomb of St. Catherine on Mount Sinai in 1470. Hans Thürer, a pilgrim to Jerusalem in 1479, advised pilgrims to have their coat of arms painted before their journey, so that they could take them with them and stick them or hang them in the holy places. Jan Aert, in 1481, noted that pilgrims hung seals attached to parchment tails and written paper from the branches of a dry tree overlooking the Red Sea in the Gulf of Aqaba. And finally, Georg von Kuppenberg in 1483 claimed that Christian knights left their paper coat of arms in holy places. Both texts and emblems were displayed on mobile support. The range of personal writings and signs in the holy places was therefore wider than we can imagine from the few elements remaining. And graffiti have to be understood in relation to these other practices. We are aware that the dozens of graffiti we study are only a tiny fraction of what once was. But it is even worse with signs painted on removable supports, as wood and paper, which completely vanished, leaving us to think that they had never existed.
So let us now turn our attention to the 4 painted sheets of paper briefly mentioned by Clermont-Ganneau. So they were under an old plaster glued to the interior wall of the cenacle. So the cenacle is in Jerusalem on the Mount Zion. You have here the map. And it is considered the site where many major events described in the New Testament took place, mainly the Last Supper and the descent of the Holy Spirit upon the disciples on the day of Pentecost. The history of these monuments is checkered, but since 1337, it was part of a Franciscan convent in which they took care of pilgrims arriving from Western Europe. And in 1524, they were expelled by Suleiman the Magnificent, and the church was converted into a mosque. So its walls were probably covered with plaster at this time. Here we have a recent picture. So therefore, from these two dates, the cenacle was controlled by the Latins, and Western pilgrims could probably leave their signs more easily than in the other loca sancta. So on the top of the first leaf, the name Gunstgöder von Nuremberg is written in Gothic character. It is Konrad Göder von Eroldsberg, a patrician of Nuremberg. Then the date of his travel is in Arabic numerals, 1474. And finally, his coat of arms, azure with 3 stars gules, topped by a helmet crested with an 8-point star. On the second sheet of paper, we read the name of Sigmund Laber, a Bavarian nobleman, and above is a coat of arms, gules on fesse argent, with 2 figures resembling fish tails, probably. Maybe an allusion to his name, Laber, a type of codfish, morue. So it's an hypothesis. The third paper was not seen by the archaeologists, by Clermont-Ganneau, but the workers who discovered it reported it displayed 2 arms crossed. And nothing is known about the fourth. Clermont-Ganneau does not give any details about the materiality of this paper, their size, the type of paper, whether or not there was a watermark. And we don't know where the original papers and the pictures, the photographs are preserved today, unfortunately. But what we know is that in the 14th century, the use of paper became more and more frequent in administration and chancelleries in Europe, and finally overwhelming in the 15th century. But what was the situation in other contexts? Did pilgrims usually have paper at their disposal? And we have a few clues in the pilgrimage accounts. Niccolò da Bonzi took his notes on tablets, and almost 2 centuries later, Denis Posso was still doing the same. Bertrandon de la Brocquière used a notebook, and Jean et Anselme Adorno explained they ran out of paper in 1470 on Mount Sinai, and the Greek monks gave them some. David Villard, in the 16th century, mentions buying a handful of fine white paper to write on the way. From a contextual point of view, we know that written posters were used on the walls and the pillars of church for temporarily displaying various pastoral information about masses, festivities, prayer, and so on. For instance, in Aurillac for indulgence, or in Spain during the Synod of the Diocese of Toledo. However, these written posters, well, it's just to show you also, we have testimony on paintings. However, these written posters and flyers are the poor relation of codicology, less well known than the printed ones, because these handwritten sheets were replaced by printed placards, thanks to technical innovation at the end of the 15th century. And this evolution went hand in hand with the general development of exposed writings in tones, which reached its apogee at the beginning of the modern period, and for which we have spoken of a real public graphosphere, to use Simon Franklin's expression. In the Holy Land, this new new form of communication of the pilgrims seems very tight in time. I won't read all these dates, but you can see that it's very close, from 1460s to 1480s. So it's very close in time and probably in space too, because all these pilgrims came from the Germanic area and the Netherlands. So should we see a connection with the birth of printing and the circulation of paper? And what is the status of this writing, similar to graffiti in terms of contents, but materially linked to the world of manuscripts? So really on the margin. So it's our question. We have not the answer, but as we are here to ask for questions.
Some pilgrims had the choice between writing on a mobile or permanent support, and sometimes used both of them. We know from their account that in 1470, Anselme and Jean Adorno left a poem for Saint Catherine. You have the Latin text here. On a sheet of paper bearing their painted coat of arms. But they also left a graffito in the refectory of the same monastery, which is not mentioned in the pilgrim account. Writing on paper was quicker and more convenient because the writer was familiar with the medium. It was easier to add color, an essential element in heraldry. Papers were even more visible than ordinary graffiti, as the white sheets of paper contrasted with the blurred background. They could be hung anywhere, even on dirty surfaces or mosaics, and could be prepared before. Nevertheless, this way of leaving signs did not replace graffiti, but remained complementary and seem to have lasted only for a few decades. Indeed, these sheets of paper raise the question of spontaneity and premeditation. Having paper and something to write on may be an evidence of premeditation, as everybody does not travel with such equipment. Hans Dürer, a prominent patrician of Nuremberg, I have quoted, in 1479, advises pilgrims to have their coat of arms painted before leaving home. We can wonder if graffiti, inside carved graffiti, were as much premeditated as these posters. Did travelers deliberately take something with them to mark the monuments? It is easy, although not obvious, to have a piece of hematite or charcoal to write in red or black on the monument. But what about paint? It is even more evident for graffiti done with percussion for the sculptures, which accounts for almost 20% of my corpus. That is 77 examples of graffiti done by percussion. They can no longer be considered as spontaneous writing. Felix Fabry explicitly condemns the people who carved their names into the marble equipped with a hammer and iron tools. Some of these graffiti took several hours to be engraved and needed appropriate logistics as scaffolding or ladders. This level of development raises questions about the very definition of what a graffito is in the Holy Land and when do we start calling it an inscription if such a duality is still valuable. Another question is the time horizon of this act of writing, its durability. One might argue that paper is more fragile than stone. However, the majority of graffiti in holy places, that is 51%, is painted or drawn on the material and not in it. The pilgrims of the late Middle Ages seem not to have considered the durability of their marks as an essential criterion to the point of adapting their technique. Instead, the emphasis is on the gesture and the place. In other words, what matters is leaving one's memory for a while, but not for the eternity. The fact that they were made to last because they are carved in stone is probably a very contemporary perception of graffiti. Moreover, while many graffiti like to look for the traces of their compatriots and mention them in their stories, no author of a story explicitly mentions that is making this sign so that it can be seen by those who follow. The use of paper as a medium is therefore probably a clue to the way in which pilgrims in the late Middle Ages conceived, or rather, their lack of conception of the future of their inscription. The first question concerns the authorization of this practice. The issue of legality of writing in holy places suffers greatly from the over-interpretation of the prohibitions reported by Felix Fabry, which are, in fact, more representative of his desires than of reality. How can we explain the fact that pilgrims were able to stick up sheets of paper and that they remained at least for 50 years when the site was under Franciscan guard? In the former Franciscan convent on Mount Zion in Jerusalem, many graffitis still remain, such as the one left by Adrian von Bubenberg on the cloister vault around 1466. A little further, a shield dated 1531, and in another room, a set of 8 shields probably engraved by a professional in 1550. In 1550. Instead of prohibiting this practice, the Franciscans seem to have authorized or even encouraged it perhaps as a traditional, as it was traditionally done in the West as a way of honoring and commemorating generous donors. Félix Fabry, with the Dominican, is heir to another tradition dating back to Master Eckhart, which was hostile to coat of arms 1 century before Félix Fabry, hostile to coat of arms in sacred places. The practice of graffiti is still deeply rooted among the Franciscans, as can be seen from a lintel on a wooden door in their guest house in Ramla, on which many pilgrims' names can be found right up to the present day. The way in which these armorial lintels were reused in the masonry of the new convent in the 20th century can even be seen as a claim to legitimacy anchored in the long term.
To conclude, so in this conference, which brings together the two concepts of graffiti and margins, our aim was not to see graffiti as marginal writing, but rather to observe the graphic practices that were peripheral to it, in order to understand it better in the context of the pilgrimage to the Holy Land in the late Middle Ages. So pilgrims and travelers, religious, nobles or non-noble, but an elite, multiplied the media, stone, wood, paper, and techniques to leave their memory in these places via their name, the date of their visit, and above all, their coat of arms. The 4 papers discovered in the Cenacle are the visible trace of a large-scale phenomenon which today is only known through clues in pilgrimage accounts. This graffiti, the graffiti and these marks made by pilgrims in the 14th, 15th century must be highlighted by the general context. First, the heraldry in the sacred space, which increased considerably from the 13th century onwards, and the church was literally invaded by coats of arms on stained glass windows, tombs, textiles, liturgical objects, etc. Then the spread of paper, a writing medium that was particularly well suited to travel. And the corollary of these 2 points, the evolution of modes of communication and decoration in the church, a space that welcomes mobile, hanging elements in non-permanent material. That is why they are rarely preserved. So far from being a marginal practice, leaving one's mark in the holy places, whatever the support, seem to be authorized and even encouraged by the guardian of this place themselves, the Franciscans. And there is even a political reason behind this. So this devotional gesture was also linked to an economy of pilgrimage, but it's another subject. We thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. I would like to thank all of the organizers of this wonderful conference and for inviting me to share with you my research, which I'm doing during the last 3-4 years. And this, the project itself is called The Armenian Inscriptions of the Holy Land and Sinai. And currently we are with Professor Michael Stone and Jana Cechanewicz. We are working on the first volume of that corpus, which will include the Armenian inscriptions of Jerusalem. So today I will speak about only the Holy Sepulchre. In many sanctuaries of the Holy Land, apart from the regular inscriptions, one can find a large number of graffiti in various languages, which were left by pilgrims who visited those holy places at different times, connecting in this way their names with those holy sites. It is noteworthy that over time, the abundance of inscriptions and graffiti led to the reduction of favorable surfaces for engraving in individual sanctuaries, as a result of which sometimes a graffito was scratched or engraved on an earlier inscription or graffito, then another one, and so on. and so on. These chronologically consecutive graffiti were often incised in different languages, creating a mosaic of multi-layered writings with different alphabets, which in turn can be of great interest to researchers dealing with cross-cultural histories. So here we see the Georgian inscription there. I don't know if we can, the Georgian inscription. So there, great. A Georgian inscription, then a Syriac Latin inscription, and this we can really call a palimpsest, because the first writing is in Armenian alphabet and the Armenian text, then an Arabic text or in Arabic character, I don't know, that's all added later. So this is truly a palimpsest, which we use today. Shortly after the declaration of Christianity as the state religion in Armenia at the beginning of the 4th century, Armenians also made pilgrimages to the Holy Land. We learn from various written sources that some of these pilgrims settled there, and by this way the Armenian religious community was founded in the Holy Land over time, which has continued its uninterrupted service in various holy places, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, for more than 1,700 years. The continuous presence of Armenians in the Holy Land for more than 17th century is documented in both Armenian and other written sources and has been studied in detail by various researchers. And one of the most important witnesses of that presence is the Armenian epigraphic heritage of the Holy Land, the collecting and studying of which has been going on for more than a century and a half. The collection of inscriptions continues today. The abundance of Armenian inscription in various local sanctuaries, their adjacent areas, and elsewhere in the Holy Land provides an opportunity to find frequently new ones. In 2019 and 2022, within the framework of the same project which I mentioned, I had the opportunity to do some research and fieldwork in Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, and other cities, thanks to which I documented quite some new inscriptions and graffiti in these holy places, including the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. According to my calculation, the total number of Armenian inscriptions and graffiti in this holy site is more than 150, and most of them are unpublished. Despite having a rich repository of the local epigraphic heritage, they are found not only in the Armenian sites of the church, but also in commonly used places. Here, this is a very good plan where the sites of different churches are shown. So the Armenian sites are marked in yellow. And here I mentioned all the places where at least one Armenian inscription or graffiti was found. So this is the location of all let's say, epigraphic heritage from the church known to us at this moment. Armenian inscriptions of this holy place can be divided into two groups, regular epigraphs and graffiti. The regular epigraphs are mostly engraved on the embedded khachkars. Khachkar, it's a cross stone, which is very typical for the Armenian culture. So this kind of thing. So khachkar, it's cross stone. So while the graffiti left by the pilgrims and the members of local religious community are to be found in different parts of the church, there are both long and short inscriptions. The regular inscriptions are relatively long, while the graffiti are limited to mentioning one or two names and sometimes dates of visiting the Holy Sepulchre. Very often, to save space, these names are ligatured. There are also a few graffiti that are not limited to mentioning names and sometimes provide important information about the pilgrims. In general, if all the information gathered if all the information given in the local Armenian inscription is gathered together, it will be possible to reconstruct the geography of the Armenian and not only pilgrims who visited the Holy Land and their routes. And on the other hand, to find out a lot of statistical data about those pilgrims, as their names are usually mentioned. This is very often happens. So with toponymic surnames that indicate the place of residence, the origin of a given person, like Akan C, which means from Akan, Yerevan C, from Yerevan, etc. So it's very typical for this site. Sometimes more than one family member is mentioned, as well as the pilgrim's professions, etc. So, and this topic is not yet studied, and there are huge data which we collected during these last years, and hopefully later we will be work on this subject as well. The abundance of Armenian inscriptions and graffiti in this site, in this and other sanctuaries of the Holy Land, should be considered quite normal, given the widespread practice of living memories among Armenians throughout the Middle Ages, expressed not only in various inscriptions, graffiti, and church utensils, but also in manuscript colophons. The desire to be remembered was due to the belief that in this way their names would be written in the book of life, and an object or some small gift even to the holy places, not only to here to the Holy Sepulchre, but usually for all the holy places, was believed to be an intercession to God. This, in turn, according to same belief, granted the salvation of the soul of the mentioned person during the Last Judgment, as written in the book of Revelation or Apocalypse of John. So we can see several lines of engraved graffiti or inscription, or even some pages of colophons in the manuscript where they just praying to be remembered, because indeed in that way they will be remembered in the book of life, so their souls will be saved. So this is also some kind of answer to the question why they write their names. Indeed, with this belief, hundreds of inscriptions were engraved in various holy places, the study of which gives interesting results. In this report, I will briefly introduce the sites of Holy Sepulchre with the Armenian graffiti and present only some examples with interesting information. So this is the first place where we find inside, let's say, or maybe it's correctly to say outside of Holy Sepulchre. This is the courtyard of the Holy Sepulchre, and this is an Armenian church or chapel, Saint John the Evangelist. Inside the chapel, we have 5 regular inscriptions on the embedded khachkars, as I mentioned, and 3 graffiti on these pillars. This is the view to the courtyard at the end of 15th century, and this is the entrance of the chapel as it is now, more or less the same. Maybe some windows are different here and here. So this graffiti is found on the right pillar, and paleographically it can be dated to the 15th century, as it is written in Yerkatagir script. It's a maiuscola, let's say. So it was used. It's still the main type of the Armenian inscriptions, not only in the Holy Land but elsewhere. But however, paleographically, we can date it to the 15th century, and 2 pilgrims are mentioned here. The drawings are mine, so I did it by hands and to be able to decipher more or less this kind of graffiti. The next graffiti is found on the left pillar, and several names of pilgrims and the date of visiting are mentioned. As it is, as we see, both of these graffiti are damaged and hard and difficult to decipher, but at least, let's say, 70 or 80% of these kind of inscriptions we were able to decipher. The next place where we find at least more than 70 inscription graffiti, in this case we can call, even some of them difficult to just say graffiti or inscription. We will see them. So about 70 inscriptions or graffiti we find on these pillars, which are found at the entrance of the church. So here there are 12 or 11 marble pillars and one, which is this one. And for easy evidence, we number it as 12th pillar. And on these pillars, there are at least one, on all these pillars, at least one Armenian graffiti. But on the pillars 1, 2, 3, and on the pillar 9 are the, let's say, the richest number of Armenian graffiti are found. I don't know why, however, we have that situation. And some examples of how is going to work here. So on the pillar 9, we read name of some Stepanos with surname Yerkain. It's okay, here it's here the Stepanos, and here by the same hand inches it a bit more. Stepanos, Yerkain, remember to God, and may God remember you. This surname Stepanos enables us to identify the author of these two graffiti with the prolific scribe Stepanos Yerkain of the late 13th and early 14th century. Several manuscripts copied by him have survived. Following on this, it is interesting to observe that the scribe Stepanos copied manuscripts on Mount Sepu in the monastery of the Holy Illuminator in the Daranahi region, Western Armenia. So here, then we see him in Jerusalem copying 3 manuscripts in 1314, 1316, and 1321. Then he traveled to Armenian Kingdom of Cilicia and copied manuscript here. So at least we have this number of manuscript copied by the same scribe, and 3 of them are copied in Jerusalem. So even we haven't the date in the graffito, we can date precisely this one. The next inscription is the most beautiful among the Armenian epigraphs found in the Holy Sepulchre. This is not so frequent. So here, I don't know, we can call it maybe inscription because it's not just scratch it or incise it. It is found close to the Latin chapel. And here the drawing shows that we have this sign is a sign of pativ, we call it. It's a sign of abbreviation. That means we have here an abbreviation. So we read, we see at least 2 of them in a very beautiful way. No other example we can see in not only in the Holy Lands graffiti or inscription, but elsewhere. And a beautiful end mark. So we read Vartan, priest of Tsar. Tsar is a village in Artsakh. So he just mentioning from where he is, or he was, sorry. Remember to priest. And the dates. The dates are usually given by Armenian calendar, so the Armenian era, which is 1353 of Common Era. And the Mason's mark, which is found here. Unfortunately, we were not able to identify this Vartan, but the problem is not here. I'm quite sure that we will be able to do that because Tsar was very famous also scriptorium, and we have many manuscripts copied here. And since now I'm working on this colophons, and I'm quite sure that we will find himself because such kind of inscription can add or write some, not noble, but some known figure, let's say. Another graffito is found on the first pillar here, and we can read, I am Khachatur, monk of Mush. Mush is a city was a city in Western Armenia, nowadays in Turkey. So we know that he came in Jerusalem from Mush, and he was there until he's dead, because we find also his tombstone there. So in the Armenian monastery of Holy Saviour, not far from the Holy Sepulchre itself. So here we have the graffito in minuscola. It's also important to mention. This is from 17th century already. So this is another and very interesting graffito written in ERC-2020, so in Maiuscola, and very well preserved and legible. As word separators, in the first line, triple dots are used twice. On the basis of the style of the inscription and the position of the engraving, perhaps it can be assumed that this inscription was commissioned by an influential person or a noble. The search for the personal name Tatul, here we have two very important names, Tatul and Asalpek, servant of God Tatul, son of Asalpek of Sis. Sis is was the capital of the Armenian kingdom of Cilicia. So Asalpek of Sis in the year, so Armenian year, and then of common era. So the search for the personal names Tatul and Asalpek in the primary sources did not yield significant results. Only one fact is noteworthy. According to a written mention, a certain Baron Asalpek led the migration of Armenians from Sis to Cyprus and Italy at the beginning of the 15th century. So this really very interesting. The Cilician sources we have examined do not report any other person with the Sis toponym and the personal name. So it is possible that this Asalpek and Asalpek of Sis and Baron Asalpek are the same person. Perhaps future studies will shed light on this question. Here another graffito found on the second pillar, Akop of Konya. Konya is a city in Turkey. The next site, and here I will show only two graffiti. Here we have the Armenian church, Gregory the Illuminator, mostly known as Chapel of St. Helena. And here in 2019 and 2022, I documented about 60 inscriptions and graffiti. 13 regular Khachkar inscriptions, mostly already published, are embedded in the different section of the church. The rest of the inscriptions of the church of the St. Gregory the Illuminator are scratches and graffiti, and the incision of their letters is executed unskillfully. They are sometimes mixed, ERC-2020 and Bolorgir, so Maiuscola and Minuscola scripts, letters. Among them, only a few graffiti are engraved in proportional and regular letters. These graffiti are mostly encountered on the walls. This is inside of the church, and these are the location, all the regular inscription and graffiti inside this church. And here we see the oldest dated graffito inside this church, but one of the oldest in the Holy Sepulchre as well. So here, unfortunately, the first word, which should be a name of the pilgrims, is damaged, and we were not able to read, but the last part is easy to read. The cross in the year 900, so in 1451 of Common Era. Another one we find on the left of the end of the stairs that descend into the chapel. So I, from Nanens, Reverend Hovanes, in the year of Common Era, 1695, and another one, to Reverend Hovanes. And the last graffito which I want to present is from 1751 and scratched on the marble pillar. We read, in the year 1751 of Common Era, I from Ismail Perhudar. So the script of this inscription is mixed, it being written with some majuscule and some minuscule letters. Despite numerous scratches throughout the writing, is generally well preserved and legible. At its sides is writing in other languages. The name Barkhudar reflects a variant pronunciation of the common Armenian name Barkhudar, which is to be found in the Dictionary of Armenian Personal Names. Concerning the toponymic Ismail Tsi of Ismail, we purpose that Barkhudar spent time in Jerusalem and was born or was currently from the city of Ismail or Ismail in Odessa region of Ukraine, formerly part of historical Bessarabia. There was a huge Armenian community in this region at this time, so Barkhudar was probably from the city of Ismail. That was for the first when I saw this graffiti, and we started to look for him in several sources, and we found this Barkhudar in an inscription in the same city on the huge inscription of the church, of the Armenian church, and he was among the benefactors or donators who paid for the construction of the church. And here he is mentioned by the term Mahtesi. Mahtesi, it's a term for those who visited holy places, so like Turkish Haji. Yeah. So everyone who visited, every Armenian, let's say, who visited Holy Land, he bring this honor. I don't know how we can see. It's not nickname, but some kind of honorable term. They take this term and they mention themselves in everywhere as Mahtesi. So when this Barkhudar was visited firstly in Jerusalem, so he brought this term and he mentioned here several years later as already Mahtesi Barkhudar. So this inscription and this church was demolished at the beginning of 20th century. So now we haven't this inscription and the church, but we have the mention of Barkhudar in the Holy Land in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. In the content, so it's very interesting, and I think this individual is happy then that we are mentioning and remembering him now. I would like to close my report with a very interesting inscription found in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and just in the same church, St. Gregory the Illuminator. The content of this inscription is remarkable. It refers to a shipwreck which affected a group of pilgrims coming to the Dominical holy places from Constantinople in 1724. This resulted in the drowning of clergymen, laymen, women, and men. And here we have Grigor. This was the Armenian Patriarch Grigory the Chain-Bearer, and he erected this khachkar, this marble slab, in memory of that people who died while visiting the holy places. So, and this inscription is found there, and we see how was difficult to reach the Holy Land, and we have so many information about these pilgrims, how they arrived in the Holy Land, and what kind of problems they meet before arriving, and they describe everything related to their pilgrimage in their colophons, in the manuscript that they copied in the Holy Land. So there are huge data and information which should be studied after after this first corpus. Thank you very much.
And we keep going, and our next paper is Adam from Poland. See, we are an international crowd. From Armenia to Poland.
Oh no, from Armenia to Nubia.
Exactly.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. First of all, let me thank the organizers for the invitation to take part in this very interesting and important conference. So during this conference devoted to writing on the margin or margins, I shall speak about a marginal country, marginal land, namely Nubia. Just to remind you, Nubia is a land situated in the Middle Nile Valley. You'll see on the map. It's situated south of the first cataract, which is here. The first cataract, which has been traditionally considered as the southern border of Egypt. Nubia is between cataracts, between the first and the sixth cataract, which is still here. It perhaps reached even southern the sixth cataract, but the southern border is unknown. Southern border of Nubia is unknown. Nubia was Christian in the times corresponding more or less with European Middle Ages. Christianity was brought there in the 6th century by the way of several evangelization missions carried out by Egyptian missionaries, however, acting with the consent and even at the request of the most important church and state factors of the time, such as the Bishop of Alexandria and even the imperial court at Constantinople. Within the Christian faith, Nubians adopted also its cultural setting, including patterns of linguistic and literary culture, visual culture, organization of the state, ideology of power, social behavior, and many others. Christianity remained alive in Nubia until the 14th century, and in some areas even as late as the second half of the 15th century. Christian Nubia had a rich literary culture, which was carried out in 3 languages. 2 imported languages, Greek and Coptic, actually Sahidic Coptic, one of the varieties of written Coptic, and 1 epichoric language that is called Old Nubian in the modern scholarship. An internet database of medieval Nubian texts launched and maintained by my Warsaw colleague Grzegorz Ochała contains over 450 records, but this should by no means be understood as an absolute number, as there are roughly the same number of unpublished texts that need to be entered into the database. In this material, wall graffiti, by the way, the title of my paper is Wall Graffiti in Christian Nubia. By specifying that I will speak about wall graffiti, I would like to say that I would not speak about pottery graffiti that are equally that numerous as the wall graffiti. So I will be we're speaking only about wall graffiti. So wall in the database, wall graffiti take a very prominent position. According to my estimation, their number may exceed 2,000, which means that roughly a half of all known Nubian textual records belong to this category. Graffiti are found throughout the entire territory of Nubia, from the first cataract in the north to the confluence of the 2 Niles here in the south. The graffiti are slightly more numerous in the north than in the south, but this might be simply connected with the state of research. Lower Nubia, the northern Nubia, the area between the first and the second cataract, is very well recognized archaeologically thanks to extensive research campaigns connected with hydrological projects, mostly with the building of the High Dam in Aswan in the 60s. Unlike the territorial distribution, the chronological distribution of graffiti is uneven. They are very rare during the earliest period of the functioning of the Christian Nubian culture, that is 6th, 9th centuries. They begin to appear in greater numbers only in the 10th, 12th centuries, which roughly corresponds to the golden period of the history of Christian Nubia, and become a frequent, even mass phenomenon only in the 13th, 14th century, that is, in the late period of Nubian Christianity, when other elements of Nubian written culture, for example, epitaphs, were not already produced. Apparently, it was during this late period that a true graffiti habit was born in Christian Nubia that dictated its inhabitants to express themselves in this form, in exactly this form. The reasons for this, for the birth of this habit, are unclear. At least they are unclear for me. Perhaps they had something to do with the necessity of distinguishing oneself from members of other cultures, particularly the Islamic one, that at that time had started to gain importance in this part of Africa. Graffiti occur mostly on the walls of cult spaces, churches, chapels, and monasteries. Quite often we find them on rocks, in places that may have had some cultic character significance too. They are almost non-existent in residential houses. There are some, but very few. Graffiti in Christian Nubia tend to occur in clusters, a phenomenon that is otherwise common in the graffiti fabric through time and space, because it belongs to the psychology of writing, that an act of writing the act of writing, how to say that in English, needs a reaction or provokes a reaction by other people who add their own marks to already existing texts. The most impressive clusters of graffiti are found in the so-called Upper Church at Banganarti, a locality 10 kilometers to the south of Dongola, the capital of the Christian Nubian Kingdom of Makuria. By the way, Banganarti, so the two toponyms are here. Dongola, marked as Old Dongola, is here. It was the capital of the medieval Christian Kingdom of Makuria, and Banganarti is a locality just 10 kilometers to the south or southeast of Dongola. So in this upper church at Banganarti, graffiti densely cover all undecorated parts of the walls and pillars at the height of approximately a level of an adult standing on the floor, occurring with particular intensity in the entrances to chapels surrounding the central space. This is the east face of a central pillar of the church, and this is eastern wall of chapel 22, and entrance, actually the northern entrance to chapel 3 in this church. In the places that were most desirable and convenient from the point of view of their authors, of the authors of the graffiti, one can observe a kind of stratigraphy of graffiti. One started to write at the top, so somewhere there, at the top left of the space, and then moved to the right and to the bottom. After the space was completely filled with inscriptions, it was covered with a new layer of whitewash to create space for subsequent products of writing. Traces of inscriptions from earlier layers of whitewash can be seen here and there between the letters of the topmost layer. I don't know if you see that, but here we see traces of graffiti belonging to an earlier layer of writing. we have exactly what Veronique called palimpsest here, and this is the palimpsest of different layers of writing. Christian Nubian graffiti are most often graffiti in the proper sense of the word. That is, they are executed through scratching or carving with a sharp tool in a hard surface, such as stone, brick, or plaster. Here we have plaster on the walls of the church. Next to them, there are also, although less frequently, dipinti, that are texts and drawings painted with black paint, more rarely violet or red, using a brush or a pen. Apart from the technique of execution, graffiti and dipinti do not differ from each other with respect to the form and the message they transmit. And they will be treated here as a whole under the single cover graffiti. The style of writing is mostly the so-called Nubian type majuscules. This is the type of writing we observe here. Sometimes an ogival inclined majuscule, rarely an upright majuscule of the epigraphic type. The inscriptions show various degrees of literacy and care in their execution. At one end, we find products of extremely skillful, trained hands that wrote in even lines with even letters, using a rich repertoire of scribal endeavors connected with the Nubian literary tradition. At the other, crude graffiti betraying rather limited experience in writing, with various transitional stages in between the two ends of the spectrum. The above observations let us raise the question of the authorship of the inscription, of the graffiti. This is what Carlo underlined in the speech of this morning. So were graffiti the work of the individuals mentioned in them, or were they rather made by someone else? It is my impression that both situations occurred. Simple inscriptions containing only proper names and made by unskilled hands must have been the work of the protagonists themselves. Inscriptions showing careful technical and literary form had a chance to be made by professionals commissioned by the protagonists, probably members of the clergy of a given church, here the church in Banganarti. This last point applies in particular to dipinti. It is difficult to imagine that believers would come to the church equipped with ink and pen. Writing materials were with a properly prepared scribe, both in the technical and literary sense, had to be available on site. Graffiti of Christian Nubia are edited in all three languages of Christian Nubian literacy, that is Greek, Sahidic, Coptic, and Old Nubian. By the way, all three languages use the same alphabet. So they are, it's impossible to recognize the language solely on the graphic form. You have to read the text. There is an interesting chronological difference between the languages, namely Greek graffiti occur throughout the entire period of Nubian Christianity from the 6th to the 14th century, Greek graffiti. Coptic only in its first part until more or less 11th century, and Old Nubian only in its second half, starting with the 11th century until the 14th, 15th century. It's so because literary Coptic died in the 11th century, also in Egypt. The Copts started to speak and write Arabic in the central Middle Ages, let us say. So at the same time, Coptic disappeared also in Nubia. A common phenomenon of graffiti texts is a frequent code switching, that is, the use of more than one language in a single communicative episode. it affects mostly inscriptions constructed according to the pattern I saw and so did something. Mostly I saw and so wrote this. A text of this kind may start with the personal pronoun of the first person singular I in one language and end with the verb in another. If Coptic and Old Nubian graffiti are relatively correct grammatically, Greek graffiti, especially those of the late period, show a large degree of grammatical distortion, affecting all constitutive elements of the language, including phonetics, morphology, syntax, and also vocabulary. Obviously, Greek, imported to Nubia at the time of the evangelization in the 6th century, underwent far-reaching changes during a millennium of its use. Importantly, even in this late period, Greek was still felt as a proper means of expressing a religious message. When it comes to the form and content of graffiti, several groups can be distinguished based on a simple genetic criterion, that is, from the formally simplest graffiti to the most complex ones. I will discuss this issue based on material from the so-called Northern Church within the monastery in Dongola. By the way, there is a handout accompanying my presentation, so we will need this handout now. What is Dongola and what is the Northern Church? We have the very schematic plan of the Dongolese agglomeration. Here we have Citadel, what is called Citadel, the main city encompassed by defensive walls. Here the city developed later on with 2 big churches, some settlements, some workshops, and here we have a monastery, probably the main monastic establishment of the Dongolese administration. The monastery was built in the 6th century and was used until 14th, 15th century. Here we have a kite photo taken in the 90s before there were how they asked those models. Yeah, before drones. So it's a kind photo at the beginning of excavations, and here is the plan of the excavations. We are interested in this structure. This is the main monastery church, and here we have a very strange church, this one. This is the plan of the church. The church was partly excavated by an archaeological expedition of the University of Warsaw in 2017-2018. I was present at that time in the mission. And the epigraphic material found there still remains unpublished. So what I will present to you is actually the first presentation of the material. The church was built in the 13th century, so it's very late, and is characterized by a very unusual plan for a Christian cult building, displaying 2 small centrally located square rooms. Here you see them, from which apsidal chapels branch off in both direction. Yes, and elongated chapels in the east-west direction and smaller chapels in north-south directions. The church had a rich painted decoration, which in the western part of the building have been preserved in surprisingly good condition. I am speaking about these 2 apses. Yeah, what we found there is like that. This is a Nubian king under the protection of Jesus Christ, accompanied by a monastic saint, probably Saint Shenute, and some other figure. In the other apse, this is a detail of the painting. In another apse, we have a representation of 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace. Do I have a representation of Virgin Mary? The church walls have at least 60 graffiti. Perhaps there are other graffiti in the unexcavated part of the building. The graffiti appear primarily in the vicinity of paintings. Here you see this excellently. There is the painting of Virgin Mary, and the graffiti are here. But this is the best visible in the vicinity of these two paintings. This one, the graffiti are on both sides of the paintings, and this graffiti and this painting has also numerous graffiti on both sides of it. So the graffiti appear primarily in the vicinity of paintings, mainly near the scene of three Hebrews in the fire furnace and the king under protection of Jesus. Apparently, these paintings had a particularly intense impact on the faithful, and perhaps they were also the object of their special veneration. It is worth noting that the graffiti in the Northern Church are edited only in Greek and Old Nubian because they are that young. Yeah? Coptic is absent, no doubt because it's already went out of use in the 13th, 14th century. On the other hand, there is one inscription in Arabic. It's rather an interesting inscription because it reads ism, which means name. There is no personal name, just the word name. The simplest graffiti in the Northern Church and generally the simplest graffiti in Christian Nubia contain only single letters. Almost all graffiti in Christian Nubia start with a cross. The presence of a cross is a very important factor that allows the students of the graffiti to distinguish between them because sometimes they form a true forest of graffiti, and it's very difficult to say where are the individual items. So if there is a cross, then we can be sure here a graffiti starts. So the simplest graffiti contain only a cross and a single letter that should probably be interpreted as an acronym for a proper name. You see such a case here. We have a cross and the letter probably alpha or perhaps delta. I do not know. Interestingly, the most common, by the way, this is number 1 in your handouts. Interestingly, the most commonly encountered letter is epsilon. It's much more common than any other letters. But this probably means that this is not an acronym of a proper name, but the acronym of the first of the personal pronoun of the first person singular in Greek, ego, which means that we also have inscriptions that read only ego. This is number 2 in your handouts. So we have to imagine that the writers of the inscriptions presented themselves by the single personal pronoun of the first person singular I, omitting their names and other elements of personal presentation. I think that the anonymity of these inscriptions should probably be interpreted as an expression of piety and humility of believers in the face of God, who, being omniscient, knows the names, deeds, and behavior of all people. So one does not have a need to indicate his or her name because God is well aware of the name of a believer. The second group in the genetic sequence are graffiti containing the presentation of a person. The simplest and the most common inscriptions of this group consist of only the name of an individual. More developed ones add other elements of personal presentation, such as filiation, the name of father, place of residence, church affiliation, secular titles. As an illustration of this group, you have an inscription with the single name Anyonga. This name is here. Yes, you see a cross and the name Anyonga, very beautiful Nubian name, which means the one who lives. The next group includes graffiti in which the presentation of a person, whatever its form, is preceded by the pronoun of the first person singular in either Greek, ego, or Old Nubian, I. As an example, you have the inscription reading ego tironga, so I tironga. I think I have this inscription here. Yes. These epigraphic I statements they are very characteristic for Christian Nubian graffiti. They place the emphasis on the protagonist. It is exactly he or she and no other who is mentioned in the text, who is writing, or who is the author, who is the commissioner of the inscription. Yeah, me, I, Adam, write on the wall. In this context, it is worth noting that some inscriptions in Greek, and only in Greek, have the author's presentation introduced not by ego, I, but by kago, also I. This is the case with the inscription number 5 in your handouts, which reads, I think I have its photo, yes. So we have Kamme or something like that. Also I, Paronga, son of Arpagi. While starting with this Kago or Kame, also I, the authors of the inscriptions obviously entered into dialogue with the authors of inscriptions already existing on the spot. They added their own mark to already existing inscriptions. They wanted to say, also I am writing here. Also I am leaving my memento, my mark here. More developed graffiti are constructed according to the pattern this and this did something. In the material from the Northern Church, only the verb wrote, either in Greek, grapson, or Old Nubian paiselo, is attested in this context. As an example, you have this inscription reading, I Archonne of the Great Catholic Church of Jesus wrote this. Please note that this inscription displays the code switching from Old Nubian. It starts with Old Nubian I, which means I, and ends with the verb form grapson in Greek. In Banganarti, there are other verbs occurring in this context, such as etaxa, I set this up, or echaraxa, I carved, or in Nubian akra, which literally means I sat, but it probably should be interpreted in the sense I stayed here or I was here. Some graffiti are constructed as prayers on behalf of an individual. The group is not numerous and is more frequently represented by Old Nubian inscriptions than Greek ones. Here I present a graffiti with a simple prayer to Archangel Michael, displaying a code switching from Greek to Old Nubian. This is number 7 in your handouts. I do not have a photo of this inscription. The most developed graffiti have a two-part structure. They combine the presentation of an individual, whatever its form, with a literary quotation, whereby the sequence of the two parts may vary. The group is illustrated by 4 examples in your handouts. In the first example, information about the protagonist, a certain Toscon Kuda, this is this inscription, member of clergy of the Great Catholic Church of Jesus, is combined with the request, Kyrie eleison hemas Christe hoteos hemonso, Lord, have mercy on us, Christ, our God, which, judging by its style, must have been borrowed from a liturgical prayer. The second example, this is this one here. Oh, sorry, this one. So the second example gives information about a certain Sulua, who was member of clergy of the Great Church of the Holy Trinity. And this information is preceded by the quotation of Psalm 117:24, which reads, you have this in your handouts, which reads, "This is the day that the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it." Yeah, this is verse 24 of Psalm 117. The third example combines the presentation of the protagonist, Dureri, this is this inscription, a clergyman of the Great Church of Jesus, with something that looks like a stanza, perhaps even the initial stanza, of a hymn in honor of Archangel Michael. I mean the text, "Hail Michael, commander of angels, because you, having the freedom of speech at the throne, supplicate the merciful one for the world." By the way, this inscription and the inscription with the prayer 7 suggest that the northern church within the monastery in Dongola was dedicated to Archangel Michael, that he was the patron of the church. And the fourth example is a graffito. It's very difficult to photograph it. It's across the base of the furnace from the scene of 3 Hebrews in the fiery furnace. The inscription is very long. It has over 300 meters. Yeah, I'm showing you this is the end of the inscription. So it's a graffito written under the scene of 3 Hebrews in fiery furnace. It has information about the author, a certain Ishai, deacon of the Great Church of the Holy Trinity and Lord of Elders, a secular title, preceded by a much corrupted and slightly modified Hermos. It's the model verse of the 7th odd of a canon ascribed to Germanos, Patriarch of Constantinople, between 715 and 730. So it's a liturgical song composed by, authored by one of the most famous poets of the early Byzantine period. It is easy to observe that the quotations found in this group of graffiti come mostly from songs, both the Old Testament songs that are psalms and liturgical songs that are hymns. Obviously, it was the musical setting of the liturgy that made the greatest impression on visitors to cult places. It is not excluded that some of the hymns they quoted were even sung by them in the place of worship. Some graffiti escaped the genetic classification presented above. This group includes primarily the names of saints. Oh, I do not have the inscription number 12. So this group includes primarily the names of saints, which should probably be interpreted as acclamations or invocations. As example, you have the graffito number 12 with the names of 3 most popular archangels in Nubia, Michael, Gabriel, and Raphael. Sometimes textual graffiti occur in company of figural ones. This is the case here. The photo shows a schematic drawing of a church with the inscription above it reading Kyriakos Kle, that is Church of Saint Kyriakos. The drawing is placed on the outer wall of the church next to other similar drawings. Apparently, some churches were illustrated on the exterior of this church, perhaps the churches that existed in the neighborhood. Already this cursory presentation of the material from one Nubian church shows that the Christian Nubian graffiti emphasized 2 elements: the person of the protagonist, identified by his or her own name and the pronoun I, and the act of execution, of writing or carving. These 2 elements allow us detecting what the graffiti are meant to be. They are mementos of visits paid by pious individuals in a cult place, whom the written format grants permanence. They perpetuate an individual before the divinity in order to establish his or her eternal worshipful presence in the cult place and receive the blessing of God. Visitors' graffiti are thus an element of devotional practice, along with kneeling, raising hands in prayer, touching or kissing of holy objects, lighting lamps, and so on. Taking into account the materiality of writing, the graffiti can be described as a material expression of personal devotion in a holy site. From this point of view, they resemble material offerings made by believers to a cult place, which also remain for a long time kept in a treasury or displayed on walls close to objects of veneration, just like graffiti are placed close to paintings. It is interesting to observe that the graffiti, the Nubian graffiti from Christian Nubia, or the graffiti from this church or from the church of in Banganarti, so those graffiti do not make appeal whatsoever to the reader. One finds neither greetings to the readers nor invitations to say a prayer for the protagonist of the inscription, elements that are quite often in the contemporary Christian inscriptions left by visitors in Christian cult places in Egypt. Obviously, the ultimate addressee of the Nubian Christian visitors' mementos was not a human reader, but the supernatural, God and his messengers, angels and saints, who brought human prayers before his throne. Seen from this perspective, the inscriptions, along with oral prayers, can be regarded as a means of communication between the earthly and heavenly realms. The inscriptions also do not contain any expression of hope for their long, ideally eternal existence. What matters is the very fact of writing, and subsequently the spiritual rather than physical presence of an inscription. Even if an inscription, a graffito, was to be obscured by a new layer of whitewash, God would be well aware of its existence. It's like lighting candles in Oriental churches. What matters is just lighting, not the burning. Although ultimately addressed to God, the inscriptions also influenced other visitors, in that they encouraged them to repeat the action of epigraphic devotion, which in consequence led to clustering of inscriptions in certain places. The aim to emulate the epigraphic behaviors of predecessors is clearly evident in starting the personal presentation of one's own inscription with kago, also I am writing here. Adding one's own mark to already existing items incorporated its author into the community of believers, identified his or her position within this community through his or her names and titles, and showed his or her cultural preferences through the choice of language and the form of his or her inscription. Thus, writings on the walls of the church was not only a religious gesture, but also a cultural and social one, engaging the present and the future public of a cult place. Thank you very much.